Study Session 11. Sample Process Recording Number 1. Narrative Model. Interview with Client. Introduction. It is necessary to have practical sessions with students to equip them with professional expectations and how these expectations are met using the narrative model. Hypothetical cases are treated with the students. These cases are prepared, treated, and discussed for effective learning and skill acquisition by the students. Objectives. The main objective of this lecture is to learn and acquire knowledge and skills of narrative approach in process recording. This may also be used to assess the level of students' knowledge about the narrative model in process recording. Therefore, the next 3 lectures are devoted to narrative models of process recordings. Relevant background data. Mr. and Mrs. B, both 79, were in a car accident in which Mr. B was driving. Mr. B suffered a fractured left leg and Mrs. B had 2 fractured legs. Mrs. B also lost her right eye and suffered partial hearing loss in one ear. They are located in the same room in a rehabilitation center. The student met each client briefly once prior to this first joint interview. Each was reported by the nurse to be anxious about recovery, each fearing for himself or herself and for each other. Areas of strength and difficulty. Help clients with adjustment to rehabilitation center. Any interpersonal needs or tensions, discharge plan. Interview with Mr. and Mrs. B. As I entered the room, Mrs. B was half lying, half sitting in bed, working on a small pile of correspondence. Mr. B was sitting in his wheelchair beside her bed. As I said hello, Mrs. B looked up, grinned, and said, "Hello, Miss Jones." Please, at showing that she remembered my name, I think, and Mr. B turned his wheelchair so that he could face me. I sat down in the available chair, telling them I had wanted to talk with them to find out how they were doing and if they were worried about anything that perhaps they would like to talk about. Mr. B immediately began a fairly long complaint about the boredom of his diet. The low sodium diet he was on is wasting away. I asked if he had spoken to the dietitian about this matter, and he said yes, many times. She was being very helpful and doing all she could, but he hated this food and the restrictions on the diet imposed upon him. I asked if he had spoken with his MD over the need for these dietary restrictions. He answered rather vaguely that he had not seen the doctor since shortly after they arrived at the center. How could he ask him if he never saw him? And his daughter, Carol, was too busy to take time out to help her own family. Carol had said that they should come here because they would have the finest doctors available, and they had been here 7 days and seen a doctor only once. I commented that Mr. B sounded very upset with his daughter. He said no, he was not upset, that Carol was too busy even to help this poor girl, referring to his wife, get a hearing aid. At this point, Mrs. B, who had been working on her letter at times, listening to her husband at other times, sometimes understanding what was being said, sometimes not from the look on her face, entered the conversation. It seems the pattern is for Mr. B to do most of the talking and to translate as necessary for his wife if she cannot understand or hear what he is saying. He tells her he will tell her about it later, and she nods and seems content. Whether or not this is so, I do not know, but during Mr. B's outpouring of feelings, it did not seem advisable to attempt to draw Mrs. B into the conversation. In any event, Mrs. B burst in at this point with a comment addressed to me that Dr. Carol worked very hard and was very busy. Mr. B interrupted her, saying, "You are defending her again, sticking up for her." Mrs. B looked at me, asking what her husband was saying. I said that it seemed as though Mr. B was quite angry with their daughter Carol and seemed upset that she was speaking positively about the daughter when he was feeling so angry with her. Mr. B said he was not angry with her. I said that perhaps disappointed more accurately described his feeling. At this, he broke down into tears, saying yes, he was disappointed. It was very hard. Then he began to make excuses for his daughter. She really did work hard and did not have much time. I said I thought it must be very difficult for them being so far away from their home, their neighbors and friends. Mr. B said, yes, it was very hard. He went on to describe the visits and general helpfulness of his fellow church members, his neighbors, etc. when he and his wife were in the hospital. He spoke of many cards and letters they had received in the hospital. Then he looked at his wife, nodded and told me proudly how she had written a letter to all their friends. Indeed, he said, every Christmas his wife would write a long letter on all their Christmas cards, 150 of them. I said that was quite a job. He nodded, smiling at her. Mrs. B caught the look and asked me what was going on. I told her that her husband was bragging about her and her letter writing ability. She said, is he? Smiling and seeming pleased. Mr. B returned to talk about New Jersey, their friends, how nice it was. I said that it must be lonely for them out here in Long Island, away from all of those friends. At this, Mr. B again started to cry, then began to speak of the accident that had hurt them so. He described how carefully he had driven, how careful he always was, how he had never gotten a ticket until just a few months ago. He was still tearful and clearly very upset. I said that it must be very hard and rather scary to be so very careful and still not be able to avoid such an accident. After a quiet minute or so, he stopped crying, looked at me and said, we are alive. We are going to get better. We are going to get out of here and go home. Then he returned to his daughter, muttering that she wanted to send them to a nursing home. She did not even have room for her own parents. I told Mr. B that it was too soon yet to make plans for their discharge. We had to wait to see how quickly they healed. I said I did not know if they would be able to return to their own home. I hoped so, because I knew they both wanted to do so very much. If that was not possible, then we would deal with that too. In either event, I was going to be available to help them sort out their plans and help them deal with any problems they encountered with discharge. Mr. B seemed somewhat reassured. At least he did not look angry. At that point, an aide came in to take Mr. B to his PT session. I told him I would see him after the session to say goodbye, and I remained in the room with Mrs. B. I moved over to stand by her bedside, and we talked for the next 10 minutes or so. Some of the conversation was about trivialities, some about her background as an Englishwoman, some about her daughter's education and career. During this conversation, we were interrupted by the nurses who had to put drops in Mrs. B's eyes. I did not feel so flustered by a nursing interruption as in earlier meetings. and we continued our conversation after they left. I wanted to touch base with Mrs. B, feeling uncomfortable that the conversation among the three of us was difficult with the shouting, repetitions, hard stares, etc. She was important too, and despite the physical impairments, perhaps the more dynamic of the two of them, and I wanted her to know that I regarded her as capable and intelligent. She asked me whether or not I was a social worker, and I said yes. And she asked what school I went to, and I told her. She said she had heard of Columbia. She said, "You know, I do not know if it does any good to talk about your problems and how you feel, but I think maybe it does." I answered what sounded to me like a hope, a question, and a challenge all in one, that I thought it did help me to talk about what was troubling me, and that I thought that was true for a number of people. Also, I said that sometimes talking about difficulties leads to new ways of looking at them, and maybe even ways of solving them, or at least dealing with them. She nodded and smiled at me. I told her that I would leave my card with my name and phone number with her, and if she or Mr. B should want to talk about difficulties, if they were upset or feeling worried about their future plans, they could call me, and I would also come and talk to them a couple of times a week. At this point, Mr. B returned from PT. He turned to me and said, "I need a straight answer to a question. How long are we going to be here?" I told him that I did not have the medical knowledge to make an expert judgment about that, but that I knew from discussion with medical staff that he and Mrs. B were expected to be at the center for 2 to 3 months. I said I could not guarantee that time period. To some extent, it depended on their rate of recovery, but that was our best guess at this point. Mr. B sighed with relief, apparently, and said, "That is not so bad. I was afraid it would be much longer. It is always harder," he said, not knowing. I agreed that that was very difficult. I added that I understood how important it was for them to have an idea about their length of stay here. I told Mr. B about the card I had left with Mrs. B, my availability to discuss their feelings and concerns, and said goodbye. I returned to my office, where 5 minutes later the phone rang. It was Mr. B, and it had occurred to his wife as they were talking over that they might be separated at some future point. She was very upset, he said. He himself sounded shaky. I told them I would come back to their room to talk to them, which I immediately did. Their concern was that Mr. B would be ready for discharge before Mrs. B, since the severity of her injuries was so much greater. Then she might be in Long Island and he might be in New Jersey. I told them I could understand how upsetting that thought would be to them. Then I said that, again, I could not predict rates of recovery, but that what I could do was work with them to try to arrange things in the best way possible. If Mr. B were ready to go home and Mrs. B were not, then we would explore the possibilities of Mr. B remaining in town, or of Mrs. B at that juncture moving to a facility in New Jersey. I didn't know what the possibilities were, but if there is such a need, I would work with them to see what we could do. They seemed reassured. Again, goodbyes were said. We scheduled another appointment and I left the room. Impressions. Today, Mrs. B seemed quite sharp, witty, less frightened, and Mr. B was somewhat depressed. Tears were very near the face today for him, and touching upon the areas of loneliness or disappointment with his only child triggered those tears. The two seem very close to each other and very supportive of each other. I think the Bs will benefit from continued opportunities to discuss their present and future. Also, the information gathered from these meetings could be very useful in assessing how realistic are the plans that the Bs have for their discharge. Generally, I felt this interview went well. Hopefully, become more skilled at dealing with the difficulties posed by Mrs. B's hearing incapacity and more confident in focusing the conversation in helpful ways. I am still suffering from uncertainty regarding my role and uncertainty regarding the aging, degree of frailty, etc. My own fears to be infirm, to be unable to hear, to have to rely on my child to do for me. I wonder if Mrs. B is angry with her husband for his role in the accident. I don't know how to respond and help when they complain about their daughter or the doctor, especially since they may be neglected, and I feel upset about that. I would also like to discuss future plans. End of study session 11. Thank you for listening.